Good evening. Thank you, George. That was quite a chilling recount of all of the security and surveillance legislation that's been enacted in a pretty short period of time. Thank you to Cass and for the Centre for bringing us all together tonight to talk about these fascinating issues. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the current data retention proposals that have been put out initially on a confidential basis, but which have since been leaked to any readers of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian across the country, or indeed around the world, before we sit down and have a good natter about what this all means and what it means for our data and our privacy, who has access to that data, and who we can trust with it moving forward. So I'm going to make a pretty wild assumption that I'm not the only one in this room who has found the unfolding of the government's policy around data retention to be both hilarious and alarming at the same time. It's certainly not the first time that I've seen a government try to regulate an element of digital communications, but the breathtaking inability of both the Prime Minister and the Attorney General to grasp what is pretty much the linchpin of this proposal around data retention, which is this idea of metadata, has been pretty funny, but also rather shocking. I don't know if anybody else likes to watch the ABC's Clark and Dawe, but they found the interview that George Brandis did on Sky News to be so hilarious that they didn't even feel the need to change the script. They literally just played the same script and mimed to it. So they just didn't have to take any creative or artistic license to enhance the humour in that situation. But seriously, let me try and recap what it is that the government is trying to achieve with these proposals and what they're asking companies to do. I should mention also, as a caveat, I haven't seen the bill, the forthcoming bill. I have only read this confidential consultation paper that probably many of you have read as well, but that was initially only intended for the eyes of a very select few of telecommunications companies in the country. But I do have some experience of working in Europe at the time that the European Data Retention Directive was passed back in 2006. And some of you may know that earlier this year, the European Court of Justice actually deemed that directive to be invalid on the basis that it posed a serious interference with the fundamental rights to respect for private life and to the protection of personal data in Europe. And that decision was supported by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which was cautioning the US earlier this year as well on implementing similar data retention type laws. So the current proposal that the government has put to the business community has been quite broadly directed to companies that provide communication services. Now, that could be anything from text messages to telephone calls made from both fixed and mobile lines. It could capture instant messaging, it could capture chat platforms, email services, internet access. It's not very clear from the consultation document exactly what that scope looks like. But we have heard George Brandis and members of his department talking specifically about impacting the ISP and telco sector with these proposals. But I'll come on in a minute to talk a little bit about the fact that there is no definition of metadata still, and a lot of confusion around what metadata is, and the fact that these other forms of communication services haven't really been addressed is kind of a lingering question in my mind, and one of the questions that I'll be asking when we do have a formal opportunity to consult. There's obviously been a lot made of this term metadata and what it means. The confidential discussion paper doesn't define metadata, but it does provide a few clues about what the department have in mind when they came up with this phrase. So the paper talks about telecommunications data, and that metadata is a subset of the following types of telecommunications data. So there's two types of telecommunications data, what we call subscriber data. That's a name, address, physical and email. It could be a mobile phone number, it could be a fixed line number. It's information relating to an individual subscriber to a communications service. So that's one type of telecommunications data. The second type is what's known as traffic data. And this includes internet identifiers like IP addresses. It includes mobile numbers that have been called or texted to. It could include date and time stamps of communications made through these types of services. It includes the duration of conversations that took place through these services, and also any location data that's been gathered in the course of carrying out those communications. So just to stress, a subset of that data apparently is what metadata will constitute. So the Attorney General has now promised us all that there will be a definition for metadata in the forthcoming bill, but I'm a little concerned that it might take the form of what's known as a negative definition, which is not telling us what metadata is, but rather what metadata isn't, which of course leaves the parameters nice and fuzzy for the security services and law enforcement agencies, and which at the same time does not go a very long way towards reassuring members of the public like ourselves that there will be a clear line between what's in and what's out. It is important to highlight that all of that data, that telecommunications data that I just described, is already being collected by telcos and ISPs. So they are already actively collecting this data about each and every one of us. But so it appears that they're not being asked to collect any additional data over and above what they collect today. What is changing, though, as George has highlighted, is the length of time that companies will be required by law to retain that data. So at the moment, companies have wildly different policies about the types of data they collect and how long they hang on to that data for. So an ISP, for instance, will have legitimate business reasons for holding on to subscriber data, so their customers' names and addresses, contact details, certainly for as long as they have a relationship with that customer, maybe even longer for audit purposes, tax purposes, and so on. So subscriber data generally is kept by a company for as long as it's relevant to keep it, and that could be, 6 months or it could be 10 years. Companies have different policies around that. But you can imagine that traffic data, which is that more sort of nebulous internet identifiers, calls made and received, how long those calls have taken place for, location data around those calls, that kind of data you can imagine is a lot more voluminous, and companies need to purge a lot more often just so that they have room on their servers to keep up with the increased usage of these devices. So you can imagine, for example, if we just think about one of our carriers, Telstra, and the number of just one type of communication services, text messages, that are routed through their network every day. There'd be a lot of them. And Telstra clearly have a finite amount of space on their servers to store all of this data, so they'll make a business decision about how frequently they need to purge that data. And I don't know what that period of time is, but again, it could be 3 days, it could be 3 weeks, it could be 3 months, it could be 3 years, who knows. I've heard of ISPs needing to purge their cache of IP addresses that they assign to each of their customers every time their customer accesses a website, and needing to purge that data every 48 hours just because of the sheer volume of access requests that are being channeled through their network, just to make sure they've got enough space to accommodate all of their customers' web browsing. So if you put yourselves in the shoes of a law enforcement agent or a security officer who might be investigating a crime, So I reckon it's probably fair to assume that most crimes that are committed these days will involve the obtaining of some data around communications that the suspect has been engaged in, whether it's to pinpoint a location or to identify who that person might have been talking to in the lead up to the commission of a crime. So I think it's probably fair to say that most crimes will involve police needing to contact a telco or an ISP to obtain some of this data. And this happens today, and telcos and ISPs in particular have whole teams of people that have been hired to liaise with law enforcement all day, every day. They educate law enforcement about their own company's policies and procedures. They receive requests from the police, obviously, to access that data. They review those requests. So there are vast teams of people out there who are already providing this function. And these processes exist and relationships exist between companies and the law enforcement community to obtain it. But you can imagine the frustration that officers experience given that there are such wildly different policies in place across businesses about what data they collect and how long they keep it for. And they probably need to act pretty quickly once they know that they need to obtain some of this data, because it may be that that data is purged every few days or every week. So that investigative window is often pretty narrow today, which is understandably frustrating. And it's these frustrations and this ever-present, if real or not, threat of terrorism that George has spoken about that is behind this request from government that there's a mandated standard across the industry that data should be kept for a 2-year period. So there's been a lot of questions raised about the process that's been followed today for law enforcement to obtain traffic data and subscriber data, and whether or not a warrant is required. And George has clarified that there isn't the necessity for a warrant to be produced now to obtain that data today. However, there is a legal process that is codified in the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act, which prescribes a form that needs to be completed by an officer who wants to obtain this data, that is authorised by an officer of appropriate seniority to sign off on that request. So there is a legal process that's followed. It's not a case of warrant or no warrant, but yes, the process is easier than obtaining a warrant. There isn't the need to persuade an independent judge that there is reasonable grounds to suspect that this person has been involved in a crime and that therefore their telecommunications data should be handed over. But there is a process, and it's enshrined in law, and so there is an audit trail and a degree of accountability if that ever needs to be fallen back on. I'm going to take a little tangent here for a sec and tell you a little bit about the content of communications and the regime that applies to the disclosure of the content of all of your communications, because blessedly the data retention proposals and the discussions around metadata have been consistent in one area, and that is that the content of people's communications will not be wrapped up in this concept of what metadata is. So there is, so yes, the government doesn't want to capture the content of communications, and I think we all agree that obtaining the content of our private communications is far more invasive than our traffic data, for example, being handed over to law enforcement, and that there should absolutely be a higher legal threshold in order to obtain private communications as part of an investigation. So Australian telcos and ISPs have been allocated spectrum by the government in exchange for, an agreement that access will be provided to them, whether it's to intercept communications or whether it's to obtain the content of communications. A warrant is required to obtain the content of communications today, but interestingly, for companies that are based outside of Australia who are providing digital communication services like email, messaging, chat functionality, VoIP services, all of these new emerging communications platforms are generally operated by companies outside of Australia, where clearly Australian law doesn't necessarily apply. US companies, for instance, require law enforcement in Australia to work through the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process, which is a treaty that's been signed by a number of countries that was designed to facilitate cooperation amongst the global law enforcement community. Now, none of these US-based companies will hand over the content of any communications without this international treaty process being worked through. The problem for Australian law enforcement is that this process is incredibly cumbersome and time-consuming. I've anecdotally heard that it can take years for a request to work its way through this process. So not a very satisfactory process as far as the Australian law enforcement community are concerned, but nonetheless, those of you who are using US-based services should feel safe in the knowledge that your content is being well looked after. There are special arrangements in place for child protection issues where data can be obtained a lot more quickly, but that's a whole other conversation. So I'm sorry for going off on that little tangent, but I thought that might be of interest to you all. So just coming back to data retention, what we do and don't know, and again, like George left us with, some ideas for questions that we might want to be thinking about and asking once this consultation process becomes a little more overtly public and democratic. We do know that IP addresses are potentially caught by this idea of metadata, and IP addresses are used today in a variety of different contexts, certainly in the digital environment, and it's not entirely clear yet which ones are going to be included in this idea of metadata and which ones aren't. So websites use IP addresses, but they're also used in email headers and in messaging and chat logs. Telcos and ISPs don't generally operate email and messaging services, but these are clearly communication services that are of great interest to the law enforcement community. So it's not entirely clear how a service like Skype or Viber or Facebook messaging or DMing on Twitter might be wrapped up in these data retention proposals. And again, I stress we're not talking about the content of these communications, but more who is using them and some of the traffic data around how they're being used. So that's one of my questions, IP addresses, well, which ones, in which contexts? We also know today that law enforcement officers can ask any telco or ISP or email host or messaging provider to preserve an account. So if they're investigating a crime and they suspect that there's a particular internet account holder or email account holder that's been involved, and they're worried about maintaining the integrity of the data around that account. It might be the traffic data being purged on one of these regular cycles, or it may even be the content. They might want to work through this very long-winded process, but they're worried that in the meantime the content that they're after might be deleted by the account holder, or it might be deleted by the service provider. So today, officers can ask companies to preserve accounts, which is essentially just taking a snapshot of a particular account at any point in time. This is a very easy and straightforward process, and companies will hold on to that preserved data until such time as they receive the proper legal documentation to disclose it to the officer that's requesting it. And so it's a pretty sensible approach. The police have identified a subject, want to preserve the evidence, they place the request, and it's done. It works pretty well. But if you let me get a little bit philosophical with you, on a conceptual basis, I think about preservation requests as being like identifying a needle in a haystack. The law enforcement officers have carried out the investigation, they've identified a suspect, which is the needle, and they've asked for the data, they've asked for it to be preserved, whatever they've done. This whole data retention concept seems to flip this whole needle in a haystack analogy on its head, where government is now asking industry to keep the haystack, to keep the whole haystack for 2 years, because there may be some needles in there, but they need some time to be able to work out where they are. And philosophically, this notion of suspecting everybody just in case there's a bad seed in there troubles me a little bit. I might be alone on that, but yes. So I query why. I query why we need this. As George has said, that we haven't seen an analysis of where the current surveillance laws are not meeting the requirements of the law enforcement community. So we haven't had a good analysis, I think, of what the gaps are and how they need to be filled. So that's another area that I would be asking about moving forward as well. So I might stop there so that we can open up a bit of a conversation and answer some questions from you all.